Hi again. Welcome back to the Quilty Life with Jenn Burt. Today we're going to talk about improv slabs. Now, what are slabs? Let me show you an example. This is a quilt top that I made. It has not yet been quilted, but you can see that it's made up of individual tumbler blocks. And within these individual tumbler blocks, it's improvisationally pieced. So what I did was I created slabs of various pieces here. I did improv piecing in a slab, and then I came in and cut the shape that I wanted. I also did it up here with some gray, some purple, and also some green up here in the corner. So all improv slabs is making fabric improvisationally out of smaller pieces of fabric that you can then cut up and use however you want. That's all it is. You're just making your own fabric. So making your own fabric is pretty cool, right? So you can make it any way you want it to be. I tend to make my fabric slabs all sort of monochromatic. That means, like you saw, all the pinks together, all the purples together, something like that. But you don't have to do that. It could be literally anything. You could put tons of different scraps, tons of colors together. So I usually only do this in three very specific ways with three very specific goals. I have pulled out scraps here, which is what I always use for slabs. So with these reds, I am going to create a slab with a very specific vibe. With the orange, I'm going to go for a specific size or shape. And with the pink, I'm going to just do some improvisational scrap busting. I'm going to start with scrap busting because that is the most free form way to make slabs. So let's do that. I have here some pink scraps. These are literally all my pink scraps that I currently have right now. And then these pink scraps came from the stuff that we've been doing in the earlier episodes of the Quilty Life. So my goal here, remember, is scrap busting. So I want to burn through as many of these scraps as possible while making the improv. I'm not really worried about anything else. So usually what I do, if that's the goal, is I just start pulling out the pieces I know I want to get rid of and start thinking about how I can put them together. So this is a pretty large chunk. So I'm going to kind of cut it down. Now, if I just, I could just sew stuff onto this. I can have this big thing in the middle. But usually when I'm doing slabs, I like smaller pieces so that when I cut it up, I don't just end up with a giant chunk of this pink because that defeats the whole purpose of having a slab, right? So when I'm scrap busting, I will generally not use the giant pieces unless I need them. And instead, I will just try to use up as many of the smaller pieces that I have as possible. And then save these maybe for something else. So I'm going to set those aside. We have these. So I'm going to go ahead and keep pulling out scraps out of this scrap bin to see what we have to work with. Okay, so after going through my scrap bin, these are the things that I pulled out. You can see there's still quite a lot left over here, but this is going to be plenty for us to work with. So let's see what I got. You notice I've got a large range here. I sort of went from some really lights to some darkers to like something that's sort of like peachy almost. I have some stuff that's prints. I have stuff that's solids. So depending on what you're shooting for, you can, pull out whatever works. You'll see here that I've got a bunch of triangles that were left over from a project. This is a really great way to get rid of these really odd little shaped pieces because slabs don't have to have any particular thing going on. You can just throw it all in there and see what happens. So the next thing I would do is start thinking about, okay, what am I going to sew together? Because I like to start doing it with chain piecing. So it just doesn't take so long. So what I will do usually is I'll say, okay, well, this piece and this piece, if I cut it in half or cut off a little chunk maybe, I can sew those together. And then this and a chunk of this will work nicely together. And if one of them's print, make sure that you do have right sides together. So I just start making a pile of what I'm going to take over to the sewing machine. And I'm just going to do that for a lot of different stuff. So maybe what I'm going to do with these little triangles is, what if I do half square triangles with them? That would be really neat, I think. So I think I'm going to do that. So I'm going to pair some of these up and just put them together like this and sew them together. So I think what I'm going to do is take this pretty long piece and sew it together with this pretty long piece. When you sew two of them together, you can then chop them up into smaller bits. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to sew along there for that one. So I'm just going to keep going with this, making some pairs, and then I'll go over to my sewing machine and sew them together, and then we'll come back here and continue. So I've sewn all of these bits together, and I have my handy dandy little thread cutter. So that's nice after you do some chain piecing. I just fed that through my sewing machine, one after the other, and end up with all of these bits. And now what I'd need to do is press all of these, and I'm going to press each of them to whichever the darker side is in each case. All right, so now they're all pressed. We are going to look at what we've got. Now, if you were doing a giant slab, which I usually am, you would need more pieces than this. But for the sake of this video, this will help you understand what I'm talking about. The next step that I'm going to do is to decide how I'm going to sew these pieces together. So usually what I'm going to do is, if I've got this big piece like this one, and notice I left the selvage on, which I can now cut off because I don't want that in there. I'll cut this into smaller pieces, but let's do it in a smart way. We know maybe we could sew it onto this, so let's try to cut it near the same size as that. So I'm going to sew those two together. And then let's see, this is still pretty long. How about if we sew two of these half square triangles together and sew them together that way? Then maybe after they're sewn together, we can add it onto this, and then that'll allow us to sew it onto that. So it's sort of a puzzle. You just keep sewing things together until you like what it looks like. This is still kind of small. If I sewed this on, I would lose something. So let's look at this piece. It's really oddly shaped, right? So we need to probably make a decision about what to do with it before we sew something onto it. So we could just come across here and then make it more rectangular, or we could turn it and do sort of out here. And that preserves more of our fabric. So since the object here, the goal is scrap busting, we don't want to end up with a bunch of extra bits that we'll be tempted to save, right? So let's try to cut off as much as we can while still having something usable. And now this is pretty small. I'd probably throw that in the trash. And now it looks like we could probably sew this onto that. So let's do that. Let's cut that off, and then we will sew this onto that. Okay, so I've sewn all these bits and I have pressed them. Now we're going to sew them together some more. So what I could do at this point, I could put this together like this together like this, and then sew these on somehow, however we're going to do this. So that's one way that you could build this, but I kind of like when it doesn't all look nice and like in rows and stripes. So when I make slabs, I like to do some fancy stuff. So let's do that. I am going to do an insert. I'm just going to cut right across here, and I am going to insert this piece into here. So I'm just going to sew that onto that side and then sew that onto that side, and maybe I slide it down that way a little bit, something like that. And there we go. I have inserted this piece, and now I have to decide what I'm going to do next. In this case, I think what I'm going to do is cut this, continue this line that we cut earlier, and then I'm going to sew that on to this somehow. So do I want to keep this angle going maybe, or do I want to go out that way? I think that's more interesting looking, so let's go with that. I can come in here with a ruler if I want to. You don't have to do this rulerless if that makes you nervous, or if you just feel more comfortable cutting with a ruler, that's fine. There are no rules for or against rulers in improv. So I'm just going to put that like that and sew 1/4 of an inch from the side. And now that's done. So now we have this extra little bit over here and we're thinking, what are we going to do with this? So we could potentially cut an angle off here and sew that on, or cut it off here, or we could sew something else onto this, maybe more half square triangles that we make and sew it on there or over there. You can do whatever you feel like doing. But I think for the sake of this video, I am going to cut off a corner over here and sew that onto that side. So I'm going to do it without a ruler. I'm going to cut here. And maybe I can save that and put somewhere else. So let's save that actually. And here. And then we can sew that onto the side, which I will do now. Okay, I've added these, and I actually think, because remember, the goal is scrap busting, and I don't want to end up with this little bit that I'm tempted to keep. So I'm going to cut the pieces off. They're just truly little jibs. And I'm going to sew this onto the top up here. So I'm not even going to cut this first. This one's straight. So I'm going to lay this on. And I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch from there. And then after I sew it, I'm going to come back in there and cut that. So you can cut it before or after, whichever makes you happy. So there we go. We've got a crazy looking slab going on here. Now you could obviously keep building this out and doing whatever you wanted to with it, but we're going to stop because we've got other slabs we need to make. So what I would usually do at this point is figure out how to sort of square it up while cutting off the least amount of fabric possible. So I'm putting this here because that's as close as I can get. There's a little point right there. And if I go too far that way, I get a notch in my slab. So I'm going to cut here. And those are legitimately too small to use. So we can throw those in the trash and not feel guilty about it. And you can cut freehand. You do not have to cut with a ruler if you don't want to. And over here on this side, let's look. So I'm going to go to this point here. I'm going to run it through this point here since I know I can't go any closer than that. And that looks good. I'm not losing too much. And those are now trash. And then over here, I would have to make a choice. So I can go here. That's a choice. Or I can go more here. Now what I want to look at is if I cut it here, I'm losing all of this, right? And that was a waste of time if I did that. So let's cut it out here. So there we go. It's a slab of your own curated pink fabric that you have made yourself. So you could continue to add on to it. You could add another insert of something. Perhaps you think, oh, well, there's these darks out here and I don't have any dark in the middle. Well, you could cut right here and put another piece of darker pink fabric in here if you wanted to. You can keep on adding to the middle, the sides, wherever you want. It's your slab. Do what you want to with it. So the pink slab is done, and now we're going to do an orange slab. Remember that the goal of the orange was to come up with a specific size or shape. So let's say that you wanted to be able to cut 6-inch by 6-inch squares out of the slab that you create. So I usually will get something that is the size I want it to be, and then I just set it over here on the side so I can keep referencing it throughout the construction process to make sure that I make it the right size. I can keep checking against the thing that I want it to be. So how do we start? The truth is that we're going to start exactly the same way as we did before, but last time, remember that thing got pretty big, and this time we want it to only be 6-inch by 6-inch. So we probably need to cut our pieces smaller, because if I did this and then sewed on that, it's not too interesting. So I actually had these scraps also left over from the earlier episode, so I'm going to try to incorporate some of these as well. They're already cut quite a bit smaller than the pieces I have here in my scrap bin, so that's a good place to start. Now, if what you were working on needed it to be very orange, then you would try to stay with, you know, all in the same, close to the same value. But if you're just making a general slab and want it to sort of look like orange or read as orange, putting in some lighter, some darker, some shades that maybe you don't even think match. Don't be too worried about getting too matchy-matchy, and just do what feels right. So I'm going to do exactly what I did last time, and I am just going to start sewing together some random pieces. So here's what I've done so far, and this is going to easily cover the 6" by 6" square, so we don't have to keep going if we don't want to. So I have cut here, and I'm going to start cutting off the edges so I know what I'm working with. And now we have that. So let's decide what we're going to do. Let's try to match up some sizes. So these sizes match pretty well. So let's sew those together. Okay, that's on. And now I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, all right, if I sew that on there, that's short. So what about that? Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Let's get this out. Yes, if I sew that together, I am going to have enough to work with. So I'm going to sew first this to that, and then I'll sew that whole chunk onto that. And there we go. We've got ourselves an orange slab. And if we lay this on top, we can see that we would be able to cut this out. We'd actually kind of turn it at an angle here if we wanted to, so it's not all perfectly lined up. You could, if you didn't like that there's this big orange piece in here, you could always come in there and do an insert if you like. There's a lot of different things you could do with this, but now you've made your own orange fabric that you can use however you like. And finally, the last goal of the way I usually do slabs is if I'm going for a specific vibe. So in this case, maybe I'm looking to make a bunch of really jaggedy looking fabric, and I just don't have that fabric in my stash, but I need it to be red. I need it to include this because remember, this is what we've been using in the previous episodes, and I want it to feel pointy, jaggedy, right? So in this case, that's my vibe that I'm going for. Let's cut some sort of jaggedy pieces that we're going to work with. All right, let's do that. And then let's look and see what else we've got going on here. So I'm going to cut sort of a triangle, and I will sew these together to see what happens. And all of this is just playing. You're just pulling things out, seeing what works. So the pieces you are sewing on don't all have to be jaggedy. If we sew on this to this, the overall effect will feel pointy. So we'll go with that. Let's see what else we've got here. So I actually have these little pieces that were already pieced from something else. So let's try sewing that on. Maybe I'll sew this one onto the end instead of the side. That would be kind of fun. And then how about this fun piece? This is pretty cool. We'll go with that and we'll sew that together. So here's where we are so far. Now we need to decide what to do next. It's a little harder when you have everything at angles, right? Because it's harder to decide what to put together so that you have more later. And you don't probably want to put these together in this particular case. Maybe you do. But I think I'm going to go with this to this, and then I'm going to sew, let's see, let's add, we've got more of this polka dotty stuff. Let's add this onto the bottom of this, and then maybe some more of this red onto this side. Let's cut that off to see how big it needs to be. Yeah, that looks about right. So let's cut a generous little piece of that. And we'll sew this onto that. Now we have this. So we think about where we can sew things together. That's looking pretty good. Or maybe that's a little longer. I actually like this better. So I'm going to cut this side straight, but you can use a ruler if you want to. Always can. And I'm going to sew that onto that. All right, and that's looking really cool now. So how about if we sew this onto there? And I'm really loving this. So probably the last thing I would do is come along this side. Now that's right there. That's the end of the fabric. So I'm going to come in here and cut right along here so that I have a nice straight edge that I can work with. And I'm going to sew this piece on. And then I think I'm also going to cut along here and add another piece on that side. So let's look at that. This right here is the point we have to worry about in our cut, and then there's a point right here. So you just look for where the fabric ends, and that sort of tells you where it's safe to cut. And usually I will try to preserve as much of it as I can when I do my cut. So let's see, we're going to sew that onto that side, and then let's sew this piece on to this side. And done. So we could come in here, cut another line, sew in another piece, cut in here. There's so many things that you can do, but depending on what you were going to do with this, suppose you were actually going to use that same 6.5 or 6 inch by 6 inch square. Now you can come in here and cut it different ways. So depending on what you're going to use this for, keep going or stop or do whatever you want to do. But the point of this one was that we wanted it to be pointy and we wanted it to have this fabric and we wanted it to be red. So we have hit our vibe. So there we go. We have made 3 slabs. Remember, the first one was for scrap busting. This one was to make it a specific size or shape. And the last one was to get a specific vibe. So no matter what your goal is, even if it isn't one of these, you can use slabs to get yourself there. So I hope you'll give this a try. They're a lot of fun. They're sort of like doing your own little puzzle that only you know the solution to. I'll see you next time for another episode of The Quilty Life with me, Jenn George Burt.